So we can move down a couple items here to a strake, and we'll start defining a strake. So we'll create the first one, and we don't need a name for these. They're just a graphical object. They could be named if you wanted to, but they certainly don't have to be. We can go ahead and leave it as a regular type of strake. And again, you put your cursor in the endpoint 1 box so that we can now enter that value. We happen to know these were created 1, 2, 3, 4, so we know the numbers of them. But if you didn't know the number, you just click on it and it'll get selected. Click on the next one and it gets selected. The location, we can leave it at the bottom. They just help with the direction where the frames are going to be. We'll move to the plates dialog and we'll go ahead and leave it as 5mm plate. It's defaulting to the first item in the list here. And again, we can select by either ID number or property name. They're essentially the same or equivalent. You can do one or the other. For our frames, we're going to use those small stiffeners as our frame. And frame web orientation, we'll go ahead and leave it as transverse positive. Other options are transverse negative, positive normal, normal positive, and normal negative. Normal positive is the same direction as the normal of the strake. Normal negative would be it finds the normal of the strake and puts it on the opposite side. For the girders, since the center line was the first one that we defined, but we do want to have a girder on the center line here, and it's going to be on the first edge of the strake. So we had to start at the center line and move outboard in order to get the girder on this side of the strake. And we're going to use a larger beam here. We'll use the 125. And we're not going to have any stiffener patterns in here. So instead of, I guess unfortunately I don't have an option for no stiffener layouts. Since I created one, that's the only option for me. So right now we have to accept this stiffener layout, but we'll fix that in a second. And deletions, we want everything to be in there. We want the complete strake. So we'll go ahead and leave everything unchecked. And then we go ahead and say create. So now we have our girder on center line. We've got our frames in every other bay. Now we didn't delete any frames, but because in the module we told it there are 2 elements per stiffener or per frame bay, it knows automatically to only have a frame on every other node. If we manually were to delete the odd ones, you'll see there's no effect. If I deleted an even one, you'd see it disappear. If we change the module and we go into beam 0, and I'm going to change this right back, so you don't need to do anything. But if we go into these default values and I make that 1 section per frame bay and modify it, you'll see it went to put a frame on every node along the length except the 3 that I had flagged. And if I get rid of those, they come back. When you modify the module, you're modifying every strake in that module. We'll change this back to 2. And you can see we have one at the reference end, which was our starting end. If I were to change that, it would go away, and I can place one on the opposite end. But you can see how those changes for the on a module level can update all of your strakes very quickly. Now these do have an internal layout if we turn that on, because we didn't have any option to not have one. So we'll go back into the properties. We'll create a layout here, and I don't want to copy one. I want to create one called null. And it's going to have stiffeners, no edge stiffeners. Create that. And we can modify our strake. To select the strake, you put the cursor in either the name or the ID box and click on the strake. And once you select that strake, I could have also just selected from the drop list here, actually. Once you have a strake selected, all of the properties will be populated in here, and we'll change that to the null layout and modify. So now we have one strake in here. When we go to create a second strake, if you want all of the identical properties that you've already gone through and defined, if I were to create a new one here, I would have to go ahead and define everything. It looks like it's already remembered the last active strake that was listed. But what you can do is if you click on a strake to select one, it populates all of these tabs with the properties from this strake. And if I say create a new one, it's created a new strake with all of the same properties. All I have to do is change the endpoints, defining it, and say create. And now I have a new similar frame. But you can see this girder is not something that we wanted in this particular strake because it overlaps with our bottom plating. So we just come in here and we turn off our girder, modify. Maybe I just need to refresh. I just needed to refresh. So it was a graphics issue there. And now we need to build the top one. Now for this top one, we want another similar girder on the end here. So if I was to do the exact same thing with girder 2 and create strake 3, I need to go into general here and go from that strake to, or that endpoint to that endpoint and create it. My frames are pointed down in the correct direction, but the first one I defined was over at the outer edge of the beam. So if I turn on my girder, it's going to be overlapped with that plate. If I come back in and change the order of my endpoints, and I could have typed in these numbers, I didn't have to select them graphically if I didn't want to, and hit modify, it moves the girder to the correct side, but it also flipped the normal of the strake. Now I need the girder at this end, so what I'll do is I'll come in and I'll change what my frame web orientation is. So instead of transverse positive, I'll switch it to negative, and it flips all the frames to the other side of the strake. Similarly, I could come in here and change the girder to go in the down direction. You can also set a specific angle if you want, but by default you also have up, down, left, right to hit the 4 major directions. And that's about what I wanted for the beam. Now, as I said earlier, what we wanted to do was have 2 strakes on each of these faces. So rather than go through and create all of those strakes, we can use some of these refinement tools on the right. The ones at the top here, and if you just hover over them, you'll see what operations they'll perform. So this converts a straight quad to a regular quad. This converts a compound element to an additional element. This one converts the straight beam to an additional beam. So whether it's the girder or the frame, it'll convert that to just a standard beam item. And this is the one we're looking for, split strake. So we just hover over the strake, double click it, and it cuts it in half, creates the new endpoint that's required. Similarly with this one and this one. So now we have 6 strakes in our model instead of the original 3. And when it did the split, it was smart enough to know it didn't create a complete duplicate with half the width. You can see there's no girder turned on the newly created other half of this. So now we have one end of our beam created. So let's go ahead and create the second half of our beam. As you'll recall, if I open the beam model for reference, we have a tapered portion at the other end. So, and it's a equal length. We could go through and create another substructure, or I'm sorry, not another substructure, another module, and generate the endpoints, generate the strakes, and so forth. Or we come into our parts tree here, and we can simply copy the existing module. So we'll make a copy of it, and we'll change this one to beam 1. So it's the next segment of the beam. Right now, these are coincident with each other. If I were to make that my view part or that my view part, they're the same. If I view both of them, you can see it's a perfect overlap. Can't see any difference between them. So we go into our definition for module locations. If we look at beam 0, it's located at the origin, 10 sections with 1/4 meter spacing, and our reference end and 2 sections per bay. If we switch to beam 1, it's identical. We just made a copy of it, and it's in the exact same location. So we can simply just shift this 2.5 meters in the X direction and modify it. Now it changed the view part when I hit modify. So if we go back up to the top and make that the view part, now we have our beams end to end. And to differentiate them, I'm going to make the beam 0 transparent. So there's the first half of our beam. And you notice we have, the frame on the reference end, but not on the opposite end. This frame belongs to the reference end of beam 1. And now what we'll do is we want to taper this in a little bit. So let's bring in all of these about half. And actually this would actually be less work if I had done this before doing the splits, but it's not that big a deal. Now, if I were to try and select some of these endpoints right now, it's not going to let me. Actually, graphically, it did select it, but you can see there's no ID number associated here. And that's because my current part and view part are both on top. I need to make beam 1 my current part so that I can edit beam 1. And now if I select an endpoint, it populates in here. I get all my X, Y, and Z values. Now you'll notice they're the same. It runs from 0 to 2.5 meters, but I've offset this module by 2.5 meters from the origin. Well, that's because when you're editing within a module, the X, Y, and Z values that you're presented with are relative to the module's origin, and that entire module is shifted. So this is essentially 0 for the module and 2.5 meters. But if we do a query the node and look at it in global space, that X value is 2.5, this X value is 5. So you have to, I guess, be aware of where you're editing these points. And this is primarily an issue with the strakes. The strakes have to be, the modules have to be shifted because the modules are used to define strakes. If we didn't have strakes in this module, we could have left the origin at the global origin and used the true global X, Y, and Z values for defining additional nodes and elements. But when you're using strakes, you have to use that sort of local module reference system. So we'll go in here and we're going to make this a little thinner. So we're going to bring this endpoint, taper it in from 0.25 to 0.125, basically bring it in by half. Actually, I didn't want to do that on the reference end. I only wanted to do that on the opposite end. And for the next one, we'll make this 2.5. The next one will be 0.25. And another thing you can do is when you highlight the ID number here, you can use the scroll wheel to cycle through the list. That can sometimes be convenient if you're looking for a beam element or something and you have a lot of them in there. You can pick one in the area and then cycle up and down. When these lists get extremely long, when you have several hundred in this small drop list, sometimes you can just pick one nearby and then use the scroll wheel if you want. Often it's easy to just graphically select. And it's difficult now that they're overlapped at the end here, it'd be difficult to pick there, but you can simply pick any portion of the endpoint to grab it. And 2.5, and now we have our tapered beam in there.